Now let's take a look at the relative performance of planned socialism. In terms of efficiency, we have low performance, and this is primarily due to deficient information and lack of motivation. Simply put, the leaders of a planned socialist system are often a very limited group of people compared to the larger population. They, however, are making decisions for the larger population, and they have to use what information they have. But that's limited because who better knows the types of goods and services that you as an individual desire? You do. And in a market system, you would reveal those desires by going out and purchasing some things and not purchasing others. And automatically, resources would get diverted away from the things consumers don't want to the things consumers do want. And it would be a dynamic process because as you change your desires as a consumer, producers would almost instantaneously have a desire to change their production allocations. But when you've got this group of people, the Communist Party, for example, in the Soviet Union, they have to try to either determine what people want or they have to impose their own desires onto the larger population, in which case you start to get an allocation of resources towards goods and services that the political party in power wants rather than what the larger population wants. And this can be exemplified in some planned socialist economies today, where in North Korea, for example, they have a very impressive military. I believe it's one of the largest militaries in the world. But at the same time, you have a lot of people that are starving. So the interest of the government has been put above the interest of the average ordinary person. So it's inefficient. We would say there it's allocatively inefficient, right? Because the resources are being allocated in a manner that is incompatible with the larger interests of the population. And the next thing is the lack of motivation. Now, this leads to productive inefficiency. That's where the goods that they do produce have a higher cost than is necessary on average. And this results from people not being motivated on the production side to contain costs. Remember, we talked about the soft budget constraint of socialism? Well, that leads to more resources being used in production than would otherwise occur. In capitalism, the profit motive is a strong incentive to contain resource utilization, to minimize costs, to be productively efficient, because whatever savings you reap as a business owner in being efficient, those savings are passed on to you as potential profits, which is the whole goal of going into business in the first place. The other aspect of lack of motivation is the workers. In a planned socialist system, because there is less material rewards available, that is, if you work harder, you don't necessarily get more income than somebody that works less hard, then there's not the same incentive to work hard. And you'll see this in socialist countries where they tend to use the stick over the carrot, punitive incentives more than non-punitive, material or merit-based rewards. The threat of being put in jail or the threat of being executed as an extreme example is a strong motivator. And that may be the path a country has to take if they're not going to allow people to have unequal incomes, or they're not going to allow people to have different levels of consumption standards of living. And so in sense of efficiency, the planned socialist endeavors tend to be low overall because of these two reasons. If we compare planned socialism to capitalism, that's the case. But capitalism has its own inefficiencies, and that usually comes from things like monopolies, externalities, and limited public good production. In this sense, planned socialism can be more effective because the larger government power that exists in a socialist economy, the government can force people, producers, to consider externalities, those negative spillover effects onto society. if the government is the sole producer, if every firm that's out there is effectively an extension of the government, then the government can make the choice not to pollute the environment or not to pollute the air. It doesn't always happen. In fact, if you look at some socialist countries today, you'll see there's actually quite a bit of pollution. But that's the choice they've made. They could choose not to do that. And it would be more effective than in a capitalist system where you may have, tens of thousands of businesses out there making very small scale but important decisions. And it's hard for the government to manage tens of thousands of businesses. But if there's really only one business per industry, and that business is controlled by the government, then the government can choose not to pollute. Okay? The government can also usher resources towards goods that markets would never create. When we looked at capitalism, we said that things like interstate highways or lighthouses or national defense may not be effectively produced by free market enterprise, by voluntary exchange. So we adopt a government to take on those tasks. Well, under socialism, the government is taking on all production tasks. So they can make sure that roads are created, lighthouses are created, and they can do it in some cases more effectively. I mentioned before the hospital in China. They can build an entire hospital in 2 weeks because the government says, we want a hospital built in 2 weeks. So efficiency kind of cuts both ways. Having a large government allows for more efficiency, but having a large government creates lower efficiency because of the deficient information and lack of motivation. Overall, planned socialist experiments in the past have exhibited lower efficiency when compared to capitalism. The next outcome we want to consider is stability. Now, we learned before that in a capitalist system, the question of stability is ongoing. There's some economists, like the classical ones, and Friedman and Lucas, that believe that market systems are inherently stable. But there's other economists, like John Maynard Keynes, that says, no, they're inherently unstable. Regardless, it is believed that planned socialism offers more stability in terms of employment. Employment is consistently high. If the U.S. goes into a deep recession, people lose their jobs and unemployment goes up. So employment can be low. But if the Soviet Union or North Korea today go into a recession, they can still keep everyone employed because the government is the sole employer. Instead of tens of thousands of private businesses out there determining who's employed and who's not, the government becomes the sole employer and they can choose to keep that high. The thing to keep in mind, though, is even though employment is a stabilizing element of planned socialism, the other parts of the business cycle, like having surpluses because they've produced more than people want, and having a contraction in GDP, those two things still occur, whether it's under capitalism or socialism. That means in a socialist system, we don't get unemployment, but we might get underemployment. If prior to a recession, the average worker was producing 20 widgets per hour, and after the recession, the average worker is producing 10 widgets per hour, the worker is still employed, but they're half as productive. You might be inclined to say that employment is such an important part of a healthy, stable economy that planned socialism is worth it. Let's not have tens of thousands of employers out there responding to decreased demand for their products by cutting employment and laying off a bunch of people. But you have to be careful because even John Maynard Keynes, an economist who believed that the market capitalist system is inherently unstable, he did not go from capitalism to planned socialism. He was not a socialist. He, however, did believe that the government could be a stabilizing force, and it would do so in a capitalist system by utilizing monetary and fiscal policy, not taking over the entire economy. So the correction for the instability of capitalism, the higher unemployment, for most people is to add government as a attenuating force, not have government eliminate capitalism and move to a planned socialist economy. Okay, so overall, the planned socialist economies tend to be more stable in employment, but still have the instability that comes with the business cycle. Income distribution is another outcome that becomes very important to planned socialists. In fact, it is probably the primary reason that societies move from capitalism to planned socialism. It certainly has been the case for most of the historical examples from the Soviet Union on. The income distribution under capitalism, we learned, is unequal, and it's based on the supply and demand for a person's labor. In essence, if you produce a lot of value to consumers, demand for you is going to be high. And if there's very few people that can do it, the supply of you is going to be very low. Look at a Major League Baseball player that can produce a very high amount of value in terms of consumers. People throw their money at Major League Baseball players because they go to the games, they watch the games, they buy all the souvenirs and the memorabilia and all that kind of stuff. And there's very few people that can do what Major League Baseball players do. So you have a high demand and a low supply for those people in Major League Baseball, and that raises their value really high. It raises their wage and income disproportionate to maybe somebody that picks lettuce. I mean, the demand for lettuce is high, but there's a lot of people out there that can do it. So you get this divergence of income across the society. Under planned socialism, the income distribution is not determined by markets, but by central planners. And it's generally equal in consumption, but insiders do receive additional allocations. The people at the top of the political sphere, they almost always get more. And people that are in upper management may be incentivized to produce more by a potentially higher income. But it's not as great an income divergence as you would see in capitalism. And even in most capitalist countries today, the government does try to rectify large imbalances. They may tax higher income people at higher percentages than lower income people. They may have redistribution programs. The socialist systems just do it at the most extreme level, right? You won't have income divergence at all in theory. Economic growth is another outcome that is important for planned socialist economies. It tends to be lower in the long run, but higher in the short run. Why? Because in the long run, socialist economies lose static and dynamic efficiency. This decreases intensive growth. Simply put, they don't have the motivation to incentivize people to produce on the production possibilities frontier and to come up with technologies to spawn innovation to make the worker more efficient. It's just the opposite, as we saw. You know, the incentives are to not increase the productivity because you may end up being given higher quotas. So this decreases intensive growth. But it is higher in the short run due to the government controlling savings. The government can mandate that people save a lot of money. If you produce $20 an hour, they can take 10 of it in a socialist system. Whereas in a capitalist system, saving tends to be lower because it's left up to the consumer. These high savings and investment rates that are controlled by the state can have some pretty impressive outcomes. Of course, we could look at the Soviets that put the first man in space. We could look at North Korea, which has built one of the largest militaries in the world. But we can actually look at the US, a capitalist system during wartime. Back during World War II, the state pretty much took over the production machinery of the US. They forced high savings rates, which created larger investment rates, which grew the industrial complex to fight that war and be successful. And that was some of the strongest growth we've had in the past 100 years. Of course, it was short term, right? How have we grown our economy over the long run? We did it through increases in static and dynamic efficiency, intensive growth, and that came from technological advancement. The planned socialist economies lack the incentives to catalyze technological growth because instead of having millions of people out there pursuing the potential profit that a new technology would give them and sharing those ideas with the masses, the technological abundance only comes from the government. They're the only ones that would have the incentive to put new ideas forth to make the economy more efficient. So economic growth tends to have a shape where it's very fast at first and then levels off because of the lack of technological advancement. Viability, well, historically the system appears tenuous. We've lost the Soviet Union. Cuba and North Korea are still around, but that's only a small number of countries given the rest of the world. The last thing I want to mention is just like under capitalism, there's trade-offs. We might be able to get a more equal income distribution or more short-term growth in planned socialism, but we might lose some efficiency. we might lose some viability. But of course, in capitalism, we trade off a more equal income distribution for these other things.